what really happens after the breach, what changes, and what doesn't. We take you inside the moments where leaders stop planning and start responding. We unpack how cybersecurity and leadership vary across industries, what it takes to manage different frameworks, different technologies, and different kind of scenarios. If you are in the thick of it, building, protecting, and leading in complexity, you will love this conversation.
The reason I ended up in Dubai was because Careem famously had their 15.5 million record breach. And post-response, as part of your lessons learned, is write up your lessons learned. But then if there's a way, if you have a community to share it within, then potentially share a sanitized even version. People tend to outsource problems, and you can't outsource a problem. You can outsource a process, but you can't outsource a problem. So therefore, availability becomes king. Business continuity becomes king. Why? Because it's about actually ensuring that the business is kept running. More often than not, in order to fix security, you have to fix the company, and you have to fix a lot more than just the security team.
Hello and welcome to the Unpatched Conversations, where we have honest discussions at the crossroads of leadership, technology, and culture. Discussions that go beyond headlines, from those living it every day. We are joined by leaders, decision makers, and innovators who share what it really takes to lead securely in a digital-first world. Our today's guest is Mr. Owen. He has been in boardrooms, in war rooms, and even breaches. He has worked with startups, with governments, and critical infrastructure, not just shaping programs related to cybersecurity, but helping leaders rethink how to respond when things go sideways. If there's anyone who knows how to lead when trust is on the line, it's him. Welcome, Owen. Good to have you here.
Good to be here, and can I hire you to do my PR from now on?
Well, I'm always available for these kind of jobs.
I might reuse that little catchphrase as my LinkedIn intro. Yeah.
So, since protection and the impacts, all the threats related to protection are one of the key things that you look into, let me start with something that is not talked about a lot, which is a breach itself. Would it be right to say that irrespective of how experienced you are, how good you are, there is something that you will only learn once you have actually been through a breach?
That's true for every situation. Breaches are no different. But like every situation, there's a lot of preparation you can do, right? So, I mean, if you think of it in terms of an analogy I like to use is self-defense. Okay? You've got two ways of approaching self-defense. One is somebody comes along to mug you and you go, and run in the opposite direction, right? The other is that you prepare yourself for that kind of situation, and you do that by training, right?
Right.
And, you know, if you've ever trained in any martial arts, a lot of it is about training muscle memory, so that when your brain goes into fight or flight, your body still knows what to do. Yeah? Fight or fright? Interesting. No, fight or flight. But anyway, similarly, with breaches, right? One of the things that I am a massive advocate for is instant response and crisis management training within an organization. Why? Because breaches are like debt and taxes. They're inevitable. Okay? They will happen, whether it's a big one or a little one, hopefully a little one. And the measure of a good security team is not preventing any breaches whatsoever, because that's fantastic if you can, but that's not a realistic expectation. Okay, but it's the ability to respond and in the situation of a breach and to do so effectively, right? And therefore running constant drills, etc., is a really, really good way of ensuring that your team is ready to deal with that. Now, every breach, right, brings something new. Okay, and if it doesn't, then you're doing something wrong. One of the most important things, if you go back to the classic IOR methodology, where it goes from preparation, as we've just been talking about, through containment, et cetera, identification, containment, et cetera. The last thing is always lessons learned, right? And therefore, after each breach, right? You have to sit down and you have to go through what went well and what went wrong. I love the kind of stop, start, continue. Okay, what should we stop doing, right? Because it's not effective. What should we start doing? Because we missed out on it so far. And what should we continue doing? What is it that we're doing well? Right. And that's something that should be done not just after every breach, but after every training session, otherwise, etc. Yeah. And that's a philosophy you can apply to projects. It's a philosophy you can apply to anything in life.
Yeah, absolutely. In your opinion, what does the reaction look like immediately after the breach? You think at some point some organizations tend to overreact, or is it sometimes underreaction as well?
I have seen every form of reaction in my time at this stage. God, that makes me sound old. Oh wait, I am. But it's you have underreactions where it's kind of like, no, that's nothing. No, honestly, that tends to happen from kind of your kind of L1, L2 in the SOC. It's why having well-trained SOC professionals who develop not just have skills, but also training them to develop their instincts. Right. When something smells funny, it probably is funny. There is a reason to have a look at it. In coding terms, people talk about code smells. Something that's off in the code, right? Similarly, when you're looking at logs, when you're looking at instant, when you're looking at threat intel, when you're looking at all this stuff coming in, and kind of sometimes you'll see a pattern, right? But it won't be clear, and there'll be something in it that throws you off. Famously, Verizon, their annual kind of state of security report that they do. At one point, I can't remember what year it was, but they pointed out that in the case of all of these instances, that they were reporting on, that evidence had been there in the logs for up to 6 months.
Wow.
Yeah. So quite often, a lot of it is about ineffective tuning and use of tools, right? And why that happens quite often is because people have a terrible habit of buying tools to solve problems that only human can. Right? So one of the big things I see, and I don't want to drive straight into regional focus immediately, but one of the biggest issues I've, in my time in this region that I've seen is that quite often people are willing to buy tools rather than pay for good people. And therefore, what you end up with is a tool implemented by a vendor that does, the basics that it's supposed to do out of the box. Their job is done. They've left. And then you have untrained security personnel who don't know how to develop it further and tune it to the organization better. And therefore, what you have is the illusion of security. You have an ineffective tool set.
Right. And how much part does instinct play in all of this?
Instinct is, so if you've ever read Malcolm Gladwell's book, Blink, right? He talks a lot about this. There's, experience is a very, very important factor. And this is one of those things where it's, again, a problem that I see a lot in the region is better tools with inexperienced personnel does not lead to better results, right? Worse tools with highly experienced personnel going to win out every time. So when you pay for experience. Don't pay for certifications. Don't pay for, nice, fancy, and there's a lot of focus on, shall we say, third level qualifications and professional certifications in the region. Some of them are really helpful in terms of helping a person to develop, but they don't ever equal experience.
Absolutely. And I think the same applies to not just security, but almost every field. So coming back to the scenario of the breach itself, let's say something happened. Everyone got together. They reflected upon it. Okay, this is what we should continue to do. This is what we need to stop doing. And this is what we need to improve on.
Yeah.
What happens to the business in general afterwards? as a leader, I have customers, I have stakeholders, I have my own organization. How is this impacted in terms of trust and your leadership style and your culture overall?
Again, that comes back to the culture of the organization already, right? Probably famously, the reason I ended up in Dubai was because Careem famously had their 15.5 million record breach, and I got dragged across from the UK to help deal with it. One of the things that I admire immensely about Magnus and Madassar, the founders of Careem, was from day one I was told, we want to go public with this. And, we want to make people aware. And I was like, wow, that's exactly the right thing to do. Okay. And then I was like, okay, we just need to do some prep before we do that. And they're like, yeah, can we do it next week? And I'm like, no. So it's like, so we were dealing in 14 different markets, right? 14 different regulators, government officials, etc., law enforcement. So it was like, slow down. Let's talk to everybody before we go and make a leap like that just yet, right? It was quite interesting. So some of those preliminary conversations, I remember talking to some security officials from Dubai government here, and they turned around and they said, oh, do you think this is to do with the breach that happened in a very, very well-known government-owned organization here? And I was like, what breach? And they're like, the one about 6 weeks ago. And I'm like, potentially. That would have been good to know. And this is exactly why you go public, right? It's, and this is exactly why you share information about breaches with your partners. However, culturally, there is a reluctance in this region. It's about, it's about embarrassment. Nobody wants to be embarrassed. So you need to get past that embarrassment, right? Because everybody gets breached eventually. And everybody can learn from everybody else's mistakes, or even if you didn't actually make any mistakes, if you put in your best effort and you still got defeated, Again, I'll go back to, you can have two boxers in a ring and they can both train their backsides off and they can stand into that ring. They have both put their best effort into it. At the end of the day, only one of them is going to walk away, the victor, right? That doesn't mean the other guy has failed. So it's about reframing that thought process and understanding that the most important thing we can do is make it possible for our, all of our colleagues across industries to learn from our mistakes and from what we did right as well. So one of the most important things you can do post-breach is, and post-response as part of your lessons learned, is write up your lessons learned. But then if there's a way, if you have a community to share it within, then potentially, share a sanitized even version with the community so that they understand. And obviously, I'm a big fan of disclosing it to the public, especially if public information has been involved.
Does this approach vary across industries?
Again, yes. Again, it also varies across geographies. In some geographies, it's mandatory to report breaches. In some geographies, it's almost frowned upon to report breaches. So, I would say it's more about geography than it is about industry.
Right.
Yeah.
So the difference within industries, are there any priorities that shift when you move across industries?
Well, yes, obviously. I mean, some industries are effectively critical infrastructure. So therefore, there is a much harder focus on security. Some industries, for instance, banking, tend to be very audit driven. Not my favorite thing. Don't get me wrong. I love working in banking and I love working in financial services security. I've done a lot of it over the years. But however, there is sometimes way too much of a focus on audit, which is generally, in my opinion, not that constructive. If you've got a security team who are spending their time responding to audit findings instead of actually proactively looking at the security of the organization, then that's actually detrimental.
Right, got it. And in terms of differences between the governments all the national level security and private enterprises, is there any stark differences that stand out to you?
Sometimes, yes.
Yeah.
There are, shall we say, for some governments in the so I've worked with governments in Europe, and I've worked with governments in the region. And what I would say is that there are definitely some differences in the way that they approach it. Some governments in the region understand that despite the fact that you are not necessarily a local, you can add value, right? Some governments in the region basically are restrict themselves so in terms of who they can hire based on nationality, and sometimes lose out therefore on valuable expertise,
Right.
and that can be a limiting factor. Having said that, government focus tends to be a lot on regulation, and there are some governments that are more technically competent than others. I would say here in the UAE we have strong technical competence at both ends of the emirate in general. So it's always a good thing to see, and they have a very inclusive approach to working with people.
Right. And in terms of regional challenges itself and opportunities as well, are these understood by global players as well? Or is this something that they come when they arrive here and then they realize that this is something totally different from where we are coming from?
That tends to be a problem a lot, right? I've worked with a lot of first-time vendors to the region, right? With helping them set up here, etc., and trying to explain to them why coming into this region is not the same as going to Europe, right? One of the biggest issues you have here is data sovereignty, and people always forget about that. I mean, my favorite example of that is AWS. Right? AWS is very much an engineering-led company. So therefore, when AWS were setting up their first region, they went with a very engineering-led approach, which was all the telecom circuits in the region go through Bahrain. So guess what? We'll set up in Bahrain. What they didn't take into account was the fact that, basically that meant that governments in, across the GCC just wouldn't touch them. Because every country in GCC is particularly fussy about their data sovereignty, in particular Saudi Arabia, but here in the UAE they can be pretty fussy about it as well. So that's whereas Microsoft, no disrespect to Microsoft, but their approach to setting up, shall we say, cloud presence is not as robust as AWS's in terms of the 3 data centers, etc., for a region. And therefore, Microsoft just came in, set up a couple of pops at either, one in Abu Dhabi, one in Dubai, and did the same thing in Doha. And, they did really well out of that because in 2018, when I came to Careem, obviously Careem were an outlier. They were a 100% AWS company. They were probably the only cloud native company in the region at the time.
Right.
Which was part of the reason why they had to drag me across the world to deal with it. But come 2020, come COVID, there was obviously a massive forced migration onto cloud for a lot of organizations. And Microsoft did really, really well out of that.
Yeah.
Because of their points of presence.
Who owns or controls the data when it is in the cloud? You must have heard about the recent incident about an energy company whose access to Microsoft got revoked, but they were operating in other countries as well. Like, for example, in India, overnight, their access to the whole business just got revoked.
Okay, so data ownership doesn't change, right? However, that's a bit like saying, who owns the contents of your wallet, right? Well, if I knock you over the head, steal your wallet, and run away, that doesn't change who owns that wallet.
Yeah.
Right? You still own that wallet. As simple as that. However, the problem that you have here, and this is going to become more and more of an issue, cloud is not the answer to everything. And I say this as somebody who advocates for cloud a lot. Unfortunately, most of the cloud vendors, as we know, are US companies. And depending on your political relationship with the US and your sanctions relationship with the US, you can have stuff taken off you overnight. When Russia invaded Ukraine, basically I have friends who work in various industries, including online gambling, etc. And as you know, there's a lot of very strong developers in Eastern Europe. And literally I saw situations where, similar to what you're talking about, where you had one dev team in Belarus and one dev team in Ukraine. The dev team in Ukraine were allowed to continue using Slack, but the dev team in Belarus were dropped off. And the point was, there was no communication either.
Yeah.
There was no explanation.
True.
There was no, you have been subject to sanctions, therefore tough. You're gone.
Or not even any time given for them to do something.
Yeah. And this comes back to a very kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? Really, it comes back to a lawyer-driven approach, right? Which is basically say nothing, because if we say anything, we could get sued. And that's unfortunately tends to be one of the biggest issues that stops companies from doing the right thing in general, right? Is that kind of litigation-driven approach.
Right.
You know, it's I was telling Fari, our producer here, a story yesterday where a very good friend of mine, Misha Hannon, who has a fantastic new company called 31 Concept, one of the smartest guys I know, and he was talking about the CIA, and he was talking about the concept of how you're trained in the CIA, right, to to deal with crises. Okay. And, it's basically my mind being my mind. It went to funny places. But so, it's basically like, right, you deal, what's the next step? What can I do next? What can I do, etc. Right. And that triggered, for some reason, in my very strange mind, Frozen 2, do the next right thing. Song. So, of course, being semi-professional, I replied to him on LinkedIn and went, "This is great," and I quoted, Rudyard Kipling's, "If you can keep your head when all around are losing theirs," But then I WhatsApped him privately, and I went, "Yeah, so that wasn't actually where my mind went first. This is where my mind went first." So, being Misha, he immediately responded to my response on LinkedIn and copied in basically what it said. My friends are wonderful people, I swear. But the point being that it's, I would say I'm always driven by the idea of doing the next right thing. And quite often what I find is that lawyers can get in the way of doing the next right thing in these kind of situations. And therefore, the fear of ending up in trouble with the government, the U.S. government, tends to drive people into a state of avoidance far faster than the thought of dealing with any other government, and that's just not correct. And therefore, from a greater cloud perspective, what that means is that we need to look at a situation where, and you're already seeing it, where now Microsoft are marketing their sovereign cloud, right? Now, at the end of the day, it comes down to a very simple thing, which is that there is probably at some point in the future going to be similar to the great AT&T breakup. There's probably going to have to be geographical separation.
Right.
Yeah. And that's going to be difficult. That's not going to be easy because, okay, in Europe, you've got the EU, or at least you still do, sort of. So the question, so you might have an EU cloud company, right? Then you'll have US cloud companies. In this region, it's going to become more difficult because obviously the economies of scale are not quite the same, right?
Yeah.
So what you'll probably have to see is GCC-wide cloud companies. And then, politics does have an important part to play, and it is a risk that people tend to forget about. I did a lot of business continuity and disaster recovery work many years ago. Coming from Ireland, back in the bad old days, we understood disaster recovery because people had a terrible habit of blowing things up. So, dealing with business continuity, there were several things that when you trained as a business continuity professional, you were told about and you had to develop plans for, but people never took seriously, like pandemics, right? War, etc. We tended to take the war one a little bit more seriously. Well, the terrorism side of it more seriously, but the pandemic one, was always one. I always felt in 2020 there were a whole bunch of BCPs, business continuity professionals across the globe, going, "Yes, finally, we've been proven right." But one of the things is geographic unrest, and this is a reality: is that a lot of organizations have engaged with the cloud to such a degree that they are highly dependent on one geography. I don't mean in geography in terms of cloud, because they'll immediately turn around and go, no, my stuff's on AWS in Ireland or in Bahrain. Yeah, my stuff's on, it's geographically in terms of the ownership of the country. When you look at third-party risk assessments, there's this concept of fourth-party risk concentration, right? And fourth party being that, several of the third parties that you deal with are actually owned by the one parent company. So they become a fourth party that you need to be aware of, because suddenly you realize that all your eggs are in that one basket. In the case of the cloud world, the US is that fourth party risk at the moment. And depending on, no disrespect to the office of the president, and a lot of good stuff comes out of there, but it can sometimes be a little bit, let's just say, immediate in terms of its effects. And therefore, as we've seen, now at the time, logically it made sense from a US company's perspective, but for the companies impacted, it didn't work very well.
Absolutely not.
Yeah.
A lot of this business continuity work and other consulting work has also come as a fractional CISO as well. While working in this kind of a role, what mindset shift or what are the expectations from the company that you're working with? Do they look at fractional roles, especially this kind, differently?
It depends on the company. Again, sometimes the biggest problem you have is that they don't see you as fractional. So you may have a T&M, a time and materials contract that says you're going to do X number of days or hours per month, and actually you find yourself doing a lot more. It's a problem I have as well, because I don't like to leave anything undone. So therefore, I tend to get it's like, okay, I might say I'll do okay, I'm going to do every Monday with you guys, or every Monday and Tuesday with you guys, and then there'll be a meeting on the Thursday and the Friday, and by my very nature I just can't let that go. If I can make it, I will. So that so as I said, a lot of them don't see you that way, and a lot of them treat you as permanent staff. And that's actually a good thing from the perspective of establishing trust. In other cases, they see you as a solution to solve a problem. So more often than not, that's in a situation where you're being brought in to replace an existing CISO, or you're being brought in to help them build an initial security function. It's an interesting thing that I would say all CISOs are fractional.
How that?
Do you know what the average lifespan of a CISO is?
Not too much.
18 to 24 months.
Wow, I didn't expect it to be this short. So
yeah. That is literally the expected lifespan of a CISO in most organizations is 18 to 24 months. Protivity did a report on this a few years ago, and that's what they found. Yeah. So I would argue that a lot of CISOs are fractional. Right.
Right.
A lot of that has to do as well with the way that companies saw CISOs for a long time, right? Which was, like if you think about your classic banking model, right? You have a situation where the CISO is in charge of information security, right? But let's forget the word cyber, information security, okay? And your 3 lines of defense, right? So where does information security sit? It's a second line, right? So so what's the first line? It's actually IT security, right? Information security is generally policies and process and maybe a bit of assurance, right? And generally the CISO sits as the head of information security, right? With a dotted line into IT to tell them what to do, which they then can duly ignore, right? And with no disrespect to IT, but when IT's priorities are on getting something, out in production or otherwise, rather than security, and something goes badly wrong, who's the guy who gets fired? It's not the CIO or the CTO. It'll generally be the CISO. Because of it's a security breach, fire the CISO. Yeah. So that's a model that's set up to fail. Right. You can't win in that model because if you do not have, if you are the CISO and you do not have direct control over the security, of the organization, then you're set up to fail. It's basically like asking me to be your bodyguard, but telling me I have to sit in an office all day and I'm not allowed to follow you around. How's that going to work? Like,
but you still get blamed if the security gets breached.
100%, and so you should. No. So for a long time, CISOs were basically very expensive fall guys. Right. I remember when I came to the region first, which was in 2013. I came to Bahrain, CISO for Gulf International Bank. And immediately I turned around and went, right, if I'm going to be CISO, then I control. And they're like, what? No. And I'm like, yeah, no, that's the way it works. And so there was a guy in charge of IT security, but he was one man. And basically I had my own security team who managed the controls. And I mean, they managed everything. Right, they ran everything from, this is 2013, so we had a tenable security center with multiple nodes throughout the network, scanning, on a continuous basis, then putting everything through a proper triage, and then presenting it to IT, then following up on that to make sure it got patched, etc. Things were having unpatched conversations. And we had, a full identity and access management implementation. We had QRadar running, horrible tool, as our SIEM, and we managed all of that, right, within our team. So, and that made a very big difference in terms of the way of approaching things. Also meant I used to have a lot more arguments with audit, but that's that's a given.
So if you look at the CISO from this way and looking at the lifespan that you mentioned, so it means the term fractional CISO would probably vanish in the near future?
I think, look, fractional CISO, virtual CISO, or CISO on demand is the other one. C-suite on demand. Over the last 4 years, I've been a CISO, I've been a CTO, I've been a CIO for different organizations. It's doing that C-suite on demand thing, and what I would say is, it's really down. Look, it's a form of consultancy. That's all it is at the end of the day. The benefit you get out of it is really how well. It's like outsourcing anything, right? One of the big things that you have in this world is that people tend to outsource problems. And you can't outsource a problem. You can outsource a process, but you can't outsource a problem. So therefore, if you have a problem and you don't have a process, right, you're just going to end up not really getting value out of it, right? If you don't have a process, but you want one created and you don't have somebody in-house who can create it, slightly different. That's where you get true value out of this kind of fractional, or C-suite on demand, etc. If you've reached a point in growth where you need a little bit more strategic thinking than you have currently, but you can't afford, because CISOs are not cheap. Let's face it. Then it makes sense to a certain degree, but make sure that you don't just pay for any CISO. Make sure you interview them thoroughly and make sure that they have enough chemistry with the leadership team within the organization. So interview them like you were interviewing them for a full-time job.
Right.
It's really important.
So that means fractional roles of this kind are probably going to be more effective or more suitable for, let's say, startups or early stage organizations which still have a lot of processes that need to be developed or need to be implemented effectively in a certain way that they spread across the whole organization.
I would say it can be effective at different stages in an organization. The biggest thing is now, and this is where when you're hiring somebody like me, without being funny, I have been working in the industry for 30 odd years. Okay. So, and one of the areas in which I'm very, very experienced is doing security and technology in general at scale.
Right.
So it's really about, when an organization is going to come to me is when they want to either set something up from scratch, right? Or when they've reached a point where they're starting to scale exponentially and they need to understand and they need help around it. The reason I talk about technology rather than just security is because one of the things that I find that's lacking in this day and age in our security professionals is, so back in the day, you remember CIA, confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And you've heard me already talk about business continuity and disaster recovery. So a lot of what passes for security and cybersecurity professionals in this day and age, they focus on the confidentiality and the integrity aspects, and they forget about the availability, right? And if you look at how technology-dependent organizations are, right, then availability is actually king.
It absolutely is.
Yeah. So the way I've always described the role of a CISO or of a security team in an organization is, the analogy I use is the Secret Service in the US, right? And, so what is the job of the Secret Service in the US? Do you know, so the first question I always ask people is, who do they work for? Do you know who they work for?
The government.
But which branch of the government?
The president itself.
Nope. No. He's not in charge of the Secret Service at all. It's the U.S. Department of the Treasury.
Really?
Really. Because effectively what they are is they are the revenue assurance function.
Oh, wow.
The reason they protect the president is because of the impact his debt or something happening to him would have on the value of the US dollar.
Right.
And that's why if you've ever worked in counterfeiting, right, the people who deal with counterfeiting is also the Secret Service. Right? So it's all about protecting the value of the US dollar. So when you translate that into a corporate entity, right, our job in security is to protect the revenue of the organization. Right? Because if there's no revenue, there's no organization, right? Simple as that. So therefore, availability becomes king. Business continuity becomes king. Why? Because it's about actually ensuring, right, that the business is kept running and that the revenue keeps coming in. And therefore, the reason I emphasize on technology is because a lot of times when I go into organizations, the problems that I'm solving aren't actually security issues. They're greater technology issues, or they're even potentially people issues. They're process issues. They're all around that concept of keeping the revenue flowing. A very simple example from Careem was, I went in there, dealt with the initial breach, etc., but then realized very quickly that the biggest issue that they had was actually downtime. Right?
Which is extremely critical.
Yes,
for that
because
kind of
they're fully online, right? So if they're not online, they're not making, and they could put a dollar figure. So I actually put a team together to focus 100% on changing how we did things within there. Including, and that involved like building proper monitoring into all the services, using tools like New Relic. So not security at all, right? And I brought in simple things like getting engineers to actually tell you when they were doing a new release, because in a CI/CD world, people can push stuff to production very, very simply. Changing the way that we did the pushing to production, implementing changes across even how the account structure worked within AWS, all of that kind of stuff. So the rule being that each service got 3 accounts, right? One of which was production, which no human being should ever touch. So the only way you got something into production was when it was pushed through the pipeline. So therefore, infrastructure had to be code, et cetera, et cetera. So,
right.
So that's from a technology perspective, but changing the culture of, getting engineering teams to communicate when they were planning on deploying something. Yeah, and that was an uphill struggle, trust me. It's because everybody likes to believe that they're independent and, and special and unique and all the rest. And it's like, yes, you are special and unique. You're so special and unique that when you deployed that, you took down 3 other services. And sorry, but this is the point. So you can see it's it's a reality, which is that more often than not, in order to fix security, you have to fix the company, and you have to fix a lot more than just the security team to do so. And so sometimes that makes me popular, sometimes it makes me very unpopular, but guess what? I live with it. The same thing I would say is people talk about DevSecOps as a discipline, that DevSecOps is a thing. I've never believed that. It's basically, to me, DevSecOps is just DevOps done properly. Simple as that. If you do your DevOps properly, if you manage your DevOps properly, well then guess what? You get security as a byproduct. Yeah.
So one of the things that you mentioned earlier as well was specifically about processes, about one particular, let's say, banking sector, focusing too much on audits and everything, which leads to something that they tend to focus a lot on, frameworks. Oh, we need to focus on this particular framework because the audit is also going to be done on that framework. So out of these 100 things, how much do you comply? How many do you comply? Why are you not complying to this thing? And if you're not complying to this thing, let's say 10 out of 100, it means you're not certified. That doesn't always mean that you're not doing well in business, or your business is not secure or not working efficiently. How much of that has turned more into a fatigue for security teams rather than something useful?
Honestly, I have a few different things I can say about this. Some of them are good. A few of them are good. No. So what I would say is that some frameworks are wonderful as funding exercises. Right? So if you can't get funding for security from anything else, then go, look, I think our customers would appreciate, and our partners would appreciate if we were ISO 27001 certified. So we should do that. Okay, so we bring an auditor in, they do an ISO 27001 audit, they come back and they go, oh, these are all the gaps. Oh, look, suddenly we need more money to actually close those gaps. We knew about them already. Like, how is that different from getting a really good red team or pen tester in? Okay, yes, I agree. It's more holistic, more across the board. I used to get in trouble when I worked in IO Active because sometimes when I'd go into companies and they go, "We want to get a pen test because," and I'd go, "No, you don't need a pen test." And they go, "Why?" I said, "Well, because you're already telling me you're vulnerable." And they go, "What do you mean?" I said, "You've told me about this. You've told me about this. You've told me about this. So why waste money on a pen test when we know there's a problem? Why not let's fix the problems, and then we can do a pen test by all means. But let's go and fix the problems first, right?" So sometimes certifications are just used as a funding exercise, right? Sometimes as well, that can be a very bad thing. So I was a big advocate for PCI DSS back in the day, but not in the way you might think, right? So PCI DSS I liked. And the reason I liked it was because it was prescriptive. There was no should. It was you will. Do you know what I mean? There's no two ways about this. You will have this control. You will put this in place. Otherwise, you're not, right? So, however, you still have a business case to argue it. I mean, at the time, I was working for a global mobile provider. And basically, I went to them and I said, we need to start complying with PCI DSS. And they went, nah, the fines are less than we'd have to spend. They prefer to pen. Yeah,
That's one way of looking at it.
no, literally, that was their approach, right? So that was one example, and at the time, so what I did was I managed to convince them to actually let me put Qualys in place and start scanning, right? Because I could do that for less than the cost of the fines, and I convinced our PSP to waive the fines if I did that, right? So that's where you used the investment argument. But similarly, the concept of merchant levels within PCI DSS that, depending on the number of transactions, and there are different audit requirements for different merchant levels. So a trick I learned in the gaming world and the online gambling world was, well, if you want to keep your merchant level below a certain level, use multiple different PSPs. Because they don't talk. And I remember talking about, I was at an ISACA conference in Ireland, and I talked about this. I said, there are ways of avoiding PCI DSS, and this is an example. And people were like, you can't say that. And I was like, is that any different from saying I'll accept the fine rather than do the work? And it's like, oh, okay. This is the point that people forget, is business at the end of the day, and it's all about money. Yeah. So yeah, I've become more. I prefer things like GDPR that demand certain levels of control, right? Swift CSP. Again, there's a demand for certain levels of control. The other big negative with PCI DSS at the time was, if you look at all the major PCI DSS breaches that happened, like Heartland, etc., the compromise happened because what happened was people were spending all their money on their, the card data environment, the card secure part of the network, and neglecting the rest of it. So every single time it was just like, woohoo, hop onto the neglected part of the network and find your way around until you got hold of somebody who had access into the CD. It was so easy. Yeah. But yeah, a lot of, then the problem too, as well, is that you have, what frameworks is that you have, again, no disrespect to any of our regional governments, but, how many different versions of NIST do you want to play with, guys, right? Yeah, again, I know we don't want to have the full U.S. dependency thing going on, but, there are how many different versions of NIST as local standards in the region? Can we just call a spade a spade? Yeah. And the other side of it too is, if I'm being deeply, deeply cynical, so you remember Enron, right? And you're familiar with Sarbanes-Oxley?
Not much.
No? Okay. So Sarbanes-Oxley was the legislation that was introduced around financial accounting and reporting in the US following the Enron collapse, right? Now, I don't know if you know, but the big four and all the big account audit houses, right? For them in those days, audit was a loss leader. It was something they didn't make money on. And they made their money on consulting. And who do you think consulted to Enron? And then, I think their single biggest trick following that, right, was actually turning it into a situation where, right, well, if we're going to get slapped on the wrist for having a conflict of interest of being the auditors and the consultants to the same business, how about we turn auditing into money making? So Sarbanes-Oxley was introduced, which basically meant we had to have far, far stronger auditing across the board. And that's become a thing globally then.
Got it.
So, I mean, to this day, I think it's only in the last 5 years that some of the big four consulting arms have actually exceeded their auditing businesses in terms of revenue, which gives you an idea of how big that is.
What role does AI play in these kind of scenarios, in terms of frameworks, in terms of audits, in terms of processes? Are we going to reach at a point where, or the current development of AI, or looking at the pace at which it is getting developed, that it will start improving these kind of processes, these kind of compliances and frameworks?
It'll start to improve certain aspects of it. It may also disimprove. Right? The way I would look at it is AI is in kind of areas like RegTech, regulatory technology, and stuff like that can be, and legal tech can be incredibly useful. And there are people who've been working on this for several years. I used to live in Cambridge a few years ago, and there's a gentleman called Tim Pullen who actually left his partnership in one of the major law firms in the UK to build legal tech, and is still to this day working heavily in that space. And my nephew worked in the RegTech space in Sydney in Australia as well. So to me, there's because again, when you've got all these conflicting standards, right, and all these conflicting regulatory requirements, how do you build an international company in such a way that it can handle all of this, right? One of the questions is if you've got a SaaS business, right, a SaaS business model, and you want to be able to collate, like, think about your average threat intelligence / XDR vendor in the security marketplace at the moment, right? What is it that they need to be able to do to actually be effective, right? They need to be able to collate information from all over the world to actually have, the right perspective on what the real threats are. And then you hit data sovereignty. It's like, and you're kind of like, while I understand and I appreciate data sovereignty, I also understand that there are security vendors out there who have come up with some great, excuse my French, bullshit that they can feed people that says, oh, my technology is not cloud-based. But it is, right? And therefore they're getting into certain customers, right? No problem. Whereas other ones have been probably too honest for their own good about what's actually happens, and therefore they've only getting the cut down on-prem version into government customers. And I think the only person who loses out in that scenario is the customer. You're paying the same for a less effective form of technology. I was a big advocate for one of the XDR techs out there. I won't name it at the moment. And part of the reason why I'm a great advocate for it is because of the service they have on the back end of it, where you can actually have their threat hunting teams, right, work on your behalf. So I implemented it across about 15,000 seats in a global manufacturing company over the last few years, and set up this back-end service as well. And it was incredibly effective, right? And it did far more than I could ever have dreamed of doing. This was taking a company with no security function, even at that scale, right? Again, they saw security as kind of like a subset of IT. So they had different regional IT teams, but they had no centralized security function. So we went in to do that and build that. But basically, this was the fastest way to get visibility out there and to get active defense in place. And it was incredibly effective, and one of the fastest ways to get to a safe world. And I couldn't have done that without it being available as a cloud or as a global cloud solution. And those threat hunting teams sit in the US, in I think Tel Aviv, and in Singapore, if I'm not mistaken, right? And that allows for that, for them to do literally follow the sun threat hunting. So you always have people threat hunting on your systems 24/7. Like, what more could you ask for, right? How quickly do you think you could build that yourself?
Got it. Yeah.
So there is a major need for us to understand. I think for security professionals working inside organizations to be able to better understand how vendor tech works, and also for vendors to be able to better explain why data sovereignty isn't really an issue when what you're doing is you're taking telemetry data.
It depends on the data itself.
It's and part of it too is because of, unfortunately, we have a stupid situation where under GDPR, an IP address can be considered PII, and it's like, yes, but if you remember, once upon a time we used to print our phone numbers in a big book that everybody had in their house.
Everyone.
Yes, literally. Like why are we suddenly so worried about this? There's a lot of stupidity that goes on in our kind of interpretation of these things, right? There has to be. It's like a lot of things in life at the moment. People have a terrible habit of, the whole concept of cancel culture, right? We've cancelled IP addresses. is effectively what's happened here, and it just doesn't make sense.
Thank you so much, Owen. It's been a great conversation. It was really fascinating to hear about your experience and your opinion about a number of different things.
And thank you very much for giving me a forum to express those opinions. And it's not always the safest, but I'll try to be honest.
That's what we expect from this conversation. Yeah. So do like, subscribe, and share, because we have a lot more interesting conversations coming up. Thank you.